tackle food security on this Wednesday morning. It's all about innovation and biofortification, and we are talking about sustainable food systems today to deal with the ongoing challenge, by the way, of food security. One of the things that my panelist has actually highlighted is that we have a challenge of hidden hunger. Not so much so that there is no access to food. The question is, how nutritious is the food that you're eating? So we're taking it a step back, taking it all the way from the top and asking what can we do throughout the chain, beginning with how it's produced. And scientists are working hard at this, believe you me. They are bringing all the best minds together, and in fact there is an upcoming conference, or can I just say a week-long event that will be coming up. There's a science week that we want to tell you about. In fact, my guest today is the definition of beauty and brains. Okay, she's a genomics and bioinformatics scientist. I'm talking about Dr. Susan Moenga, who's here with us in studio. Welcome back, Dr. Susan.
Thank you.
I'm kind of curious, by the way, how did this title kind of work out for you when you were in the dating pool? Now you're married, so it doesn't matter. How intimidating were you to these men who say, you women are just so empowered today? So you're like, yeah, hi, I'm a scientist.
No, well, if you want to, fend off, some characters, it's a very nice shield, I suppose.
I know, right? You're like, bro, you don't have the brains. Yeah. You don't have the brains to keep up with me. Yeah.
No, I think with the right specimen, it doesn't even come up, right?
Really?
Yeah, because then you have very exciting conversations.
I like that.
Yeah.
See the way you're such a scientist with the right specimen. That's
I'm
the
so
new
tired
term for men. You specimens out there.
Human beings are specimens.
Joanne, aka my director Kasavuli, tell all the men in the gallery that they are specimens.
Apologies.
Okay, let's get back to our conversation, Dr. Susan. That was a nice breather. We were talking about, obviously, sustainable food systems, but the question that a lot of people have, or the concerns, is how safe is biofortified foods?
Right.
And then also, we've always been hearing about genetically modified organisms, GMO, and people asking, okay, does biofortified mean that it's modified? Where's the line?
Right.
Yeah.
So I'll answer the first part of that question by talking about one of the most successful biofortification efforts.
Yeah.
This is the orange-fleshed potato, and I think this has been around since about 2009. And the breeding was done conventionally, like I mentioned, so identifying, the varieties that have, certain characteristics, and then of course being able to either to cross or to develop that characteristic in varieties of farmers and consumers like.
Yeah.
Now that orange fleshness is because of the presence of something we call beta carotene, which is a very important intermediate for the production of vitamin A. The reason why you can see well, we can have a robust immune system. Now, because this is bred conventionally, the assumption is, and often it's not just an assumption, these tests are done.
Yeah.
The assumption is that it is very similar on every aspect, apart from that particular trait, to the other varieties that don't have that particular trait.
Yeah.
And if there's any concern, there will be data to show that in fact, it's not a threat to, other crop species that are growing adjacent to it or within the same land systems. It is not a threat to the rest of the ecosystem, birds and insects and humans as well. Now, we do not have, so genetic modification is one breeding tool for trait improvement in crops and animals as well. Now, it's not the only tool. Like I said, conventional breeding is really the most common. It's very labor intensive. It takes a long time.
Right.
So being able to run these trials, going through, the parents that you've identified that are meaningful in your crossing scheme, going through seasons of raising their babies and the babies of that.
Correct.
And then selecting and testing that they do actually have
it takes
that particular trait. and the trait is actually stable, right? That when you grow it in, say that your primary tests were done in Busia,
yeah,
when you grow it in Makweni, do you still see the same trait, or do you lose it because there's an environmental component?
Wow, all that is different findings. Yeah,
correct.
Yeah,
and so that stability, and then year to year, do you still, do you still recover that trait of interest? So it takes a long time. Variety development on average would take between 10 to 15 years before it hits the precisely. And so there's a great appreciation for science. Genetic modification is it's an incredible tool because it shortens this pipeline by so many years, because by the time that you're, like I said, I'm a genomic scientist, so we study the genomes, just chunks of it, to try and understand what contributes to what, what codes for what protein, and where in the coding for those proteins is a regulation as well. If I were to modify this, does that actually change the state of the protein, the the functionality of that protein? And so often, even as we are conventionally breeding, there are other people that are studying. It's not just that we see that trait, that there's a genetic component that controls that trait. So instead of working with the odds of being able to get that trait into a certain background, once you've identified that particular part of the genome that controls for that trait, you can go in and modify that bit to get to the trait that you want at a much shorter time scale. Now, the regulatory framework across the world varies significantly as to how we think we should utilize genetic modification as a breeding tool. So Kenya only recently, has revisited that and has signaled a positive sort of outlook in terms of policy regarding genetic modification. But in the past, for about 10 years, we had a moratorium around GMO, so we didn't really have any foods in our value chain that were genetically modified. But even just as conventional breeding, there are certain checkpoints that ensure that if indeed you do go the genetic modification route, that the product that finally reaches the farmer and the consumer is actually safe. And I assure you, the Kenyan government is so very capable. We've got a very robust biosafety authority that navigates the whole system from the time you start engaging. That you're running confined trials in the field. There's not an impact in the nearby fields as well. And eventually, when you finally have that product, how does it measure relative to the rest? How does that compete within the ecosystem that it exists in?
So we got this.
We absolutely have, I'm telling you. And I think people really don't have a full understanding of how it's one of the most regulated processes than, say, even the pharmaceutical industry. And I think it's because it's food.
It is food. I mean, that's, you're dealing with people.
of humanity,
It is, and it's very sensitive. So you can understand why the attention to detail is there. And we appreciate that. Let's look at one or two questions, Tafadhali, Joanne, and then we can actually throw that to Dr. Susan. As we continue with our conversation, we'll be hearing about that Science Week shortly. Linus from Kitengela, thank you so much for watching. You say, good morning, K24. Many farmers have always been hesitant to change their traditional ways of farming to incorporate new innovations. How can they be incentivized to produce food in a sustainable way? And then we've got Onesimus from Kitui who says, one thing we lack is data. How can we identify or map out these areas that have serious food insecurity? Perhaps the solution your panelist brings should be concentrated in such areas, families, communities, and eventually the continent of Africa. Thanks for the show. All right, so you've got two things here. Getting farmers to embrace. So you guys as scientists have your work cut out for you. I don't know what barazas will have to be held, because when you're talking about the ones who are growing these staple foods that the entire nation depends on, how do you get them to adjust their thinking and how they are operating? Number two, if we talk about this hidden hunger, or we talk about for him, he's talking about the issue of scarcity, but are there specific regions that this essentially should be geared towards?
Right. So the first question, I'll give that within a certain context. So I work for an organization called the International Crops Research Institute for the semi-arid tropics.
Okay.
It's a mouthful, I know. Or ICRISAT in short.
Yeah.
And ICRISAT is part of a much larger consortia called the CJR. You know, and this consortia really, its focus is agriculture.
Yeah.
And just the nexus of agriculture with all other aspects of it, climate change and water, landscapes and such systems, etc. Now, ICRISAT has a certain mandate, a compendium of crops that fall within its mandate, and these are largely millets and a selection of pulses. So millets are the smaller grains. I hope majority of Kenyans will recognize finger millet, for example, what we make uji, wimbi.
Yeah, with
And then we have pearl millet, which is commonly grown in Eastern Kenya, for example, and in Western Africa, this is a commonplace kind of cereal. And then we've got sorghum as well. And for pulses, we've got pigeon pea, or mbaazi in Swahili, chickpea, and groundnuts. Now, these crops, so if I were to talk about the pulses, for example, they're this really cool legumes that have the capacity to make their own nutrition in the soil. They make their own food in the soil.
Oh, nice.
And so when you grow them, they're able to establish a mutualistic association with microbes that live there, where they supply these microbes with food in form of carbon, and they get nitrogen in a form that a plant can access. So it's a bit of a handshake that allows for them to really thrive, even when they have very little input.
Okay.
Right? I mean, it's fascinating, and beans have the same capacity as well.
So it's
now, the millets that we also work with are what we call extremely hardy crops. So they don't require a lot of farm inputs. They have, a number of them have originated from the continent. So they're very well adapted to the agroecology here.
Okay,
which is largely that there's no amelioration by irrigation, for example. They can do very well even under dry conditions.
That's good, yeah.
And they don't need a lot of farm inputs like fertilizer. Well, so when a farmer is growing a typical, say, maize or rice or wheat or whatever it is, and say, 2 years ago we had a major drought, so the biggest drought we've had in almost 40 years. What happens is that if this farmer was not climate proofing by irrigating, they almost suddenly lost their crop. But if they were also growing, maybe somewhere in the farm, they're also growing finger millet, they almost suddenly had yield, even in those conditions.
Okay.
And so, as a baseline, even just as a farmer, knowing that, look, I'm farming both for my household as well as surplus to be able to raise money for my livelihood. How do I make sure, regardless of what happens within the climate aspect, that I can still have something?
Yes.
So we will highly advocate for this millets.
Okay.
And we do.
Yeah.
I think it's been difficult up until perhaps, recently, to incentivize farmers to shift entirely to millets, because you have to have an assured market. This is the thing.
So when there's no market linkage, it's hard to convince them.
It's very difficult.
Okay.
Very difficult. However, I think generally there's a lot of signal that the market is shifting. Yeah. And because there's increased investments. There are a lot of partners that are coming in and saying, look, last year was the year of millets, the very first one. The UN recognized this as the year of millets. And those are important signals that are telling farmers, all the players, all the stakeholders in the industry that we are focusing on this. This is important, and it's particularly important for this continent. Okay. And with sufficient investments across the whole value chain, then those linkages are not as fragmented or non-existent. Farmers can have direct access to markets.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for the questions that came through. Dr. Susan, there's an exciting week coming up. You've got the Science Week that is set to be happening early next month, if I'm not wrong, right? So tell us or explain to us the objective of bringing leading scientists and policymakers together, and what exactly is to be discovered at this week-long event.
So we'll be having the CJR Science Week from the 1st to the 5th of July. Here in Nairobi, it'll be at the UN complex.
Okay.
And perhaps just to explain CJR, like I said, I work for ICRISAT, which is a member of this consortia of about 12 organizations with a lot of partners, including our national research centers across the world, not just in Africa, that have been over the last 50 years working within the context of agriculture, land systems, food systems, sustainability, climate change, and the policy framework for different country contexts in the world.
Yeah.
So the CJR came into being to kind of stand in the gap as countries were evolving. So for example, in Africa, a lot of us were just beginning to self-govern. And so we were just beginning to build our own research infrastructure within this agricultural framework. And then, and so as you can imagine, there's a lot of knowledge that's been gained in working within this context. And then of course, working very closely with governments and being able to co-prioritize, what's important within those contexts.
Right.
So all this knowledge that's been gained in the different sectors, we've got research centers that are focused on tropical research and tropical crop research, in livestock research. ILRI is right here in Uveru, that's one of them. We've got ICRA for the World Agroforestry Center, that thinks about agroforestry or mixed farming systems. As well, ICRISAT. We've got, CIMMYT, the World Fish and World Vegetable Center. There's a massive number of them. So all this knowledge that's been gained is, again, driven within that context of with all this very critical, issues coming into agriculture. Do we have tools? Do we have solutions? We have prospective solutions that perhaps we've learned over the years that we can share, we can exchange notes about what's worked elsewhere, what's what could work here, and how do we get ready for the next 50 years? How do we feed people in the next 50 years? In Africa, how do you feed 2.5 billion people? That will be our reality in a very, very short time. And so really, it's to bring researchers, policymakers, science advocates, all the stakeholders, the public, into this sort of roundtable to talk about science.
I like how excited you're getting talking about this. It's like it's Christmas for scientists. So very quickly, as we're saying goodbye, let me just combine the 2 points that I want to bring up next, which is number one, when people see conversations like this, they find it a very elitist kind of conversation. So first of all, it's, they think about, okay, that doesn't involve me, it's for other scientists. Also, this is probably for farmers who are watching the show. But generally, why don't you emphasize why the public should actually care about sustainable food systems, Dr. Susan? And then also, let's try and understand what the positive impact of improved nutrition for communities, the nation, the continent means. What does it mean when we eat better and have access to the right kind of foods? So why should we care, and what happens if we start feeding people with the right food?
Oh, why should we care? We should absolutely care. Everybody should care about
they're like, no, this is just for Ruto and his cabinet. Why should we care?
Especially Dr. William Ruto should care deeply about like we said earlier, food is intricately linked to a successful human enterprise. Our existence cannot be even relevant without food. Right? And it's just the whole chunk of it. It's not just, the stuff that we do upstream. It's that, I mean, when you think about a country like ours, where a lot of our economic output is directly, not indirectly, directly linked to agriculture. It employs majority of Kenyans, rural or urban. And like now we're talking about healthful food systems. It's impossible not to care, and it would be reckless not to care. We are the youngest collectively as a continent, we are the youngest people in the world. We literally determine, we hold the future of the world right in our palms. We have to be healthy to be able to move, you know, the planet forward.
And to be productive.
You know, and to be productive.
Right.
And so we absolutely have to care. We have to care. We have to be able to raise healthy children. We have to be able to sustain a healthy planet.
Yeah.
Right? That we're not taking too much out of it, you know, without replacing the necessary components.
Okay.
And I cannot, and of course, there's a lot of, you know, we spoke earlier at the very beginning about the impacts of climate change. A lot of things that are changing very quickly. We're experiencing, like I said, we came out of a drought and we've had extreme flooding.
Yeah.
And so there's every chance that the food as we know it today, access to the foods that we know today, might not be the case in a very short time. And those things can change very quickly. And so even when you have the capacity to buy, if there isn't food to buy, what does that mean? Right? And so we have to care about those things. And we should be asking questions. How is our government, how is our taxpayer money invested? And does it go to agriculture? Does significant amounts of it, enough amounts of it, actually go into agriculture?
Correct.
What policies are we putting in place to ensure that our children are healthy, our young women are healthy, our young men are healthy, that the future is actually promising?
Okay.
You had a second part to that question.
and you've actually answered it by saying, really, what happens when we're healthier? It simply means we need to have productive people.
Absolutely.
You cannot be a productive nation if people are sick.
Absolutely.
And are dealing with chronic disease 24/7.
No, you cannot.
But last but not least, literally in 1 second, what more can we do to get young minds, more brain power, clever people like you, driving their efforts towards innovations around food security? What do you think we need to do, you know, in these spaces, in these hubs?
So ICRISAT, as an example, developed a very high iron pearl millet. And this is being deployed in parts of Western Africa. And one of the things that we've learned from that is that when you have innovations within a certain sector, is that it creates new, completely initially non-existent opportunities for the whole value chain. So there's opportunity to innovate, to really envision what does that actually look like. How do you get that seed to the farmer? How do you ensure that there's enough productivity, that we have enough reaching the farmer, and consume aggregators, processing, and how do we ensure that that iron is actually still there even after processing? And then of course people downstream in the health spectrum, how do you also ensure that when people are consuming that they are actually getting that iron? So there's opportunity for a lot of young people to get involved across the whole, even just being able to talk about it within the media,
there's communications around it.
Precisely, very powerful in getting the right points across.
All right. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well said. Dr. Susan, this was a very insightful conversation. I appreciate you making time for us today. Want to wish you all the best, as well as the entire team and even the scientists who are gearing up for the inaugural Science Week that's coming up in early July. This is going to be big when it comes to the food and agriculture sector. And this being inaugural, it means, yes, this is the first and hopefully many to come after this year's Science Week that will be coming up in July. So let's leave it there. We hope that we have been challenged to actually do more research more. You've been asked to participate. This is not just for the brainies and the geeks out there, tafadhali. It involves you too. So Dr. Susan Mwenga and everybody within this space is inviting you to participate and also try to understand why it's important for us to continue with sustainable food systems for the greater good and for our future. Let's leave it there and of course hand over to our team from Interactive. The duo is in the house. Woo! Of Sarah and Tony. They're going to be taking a look at what's trending on social media. For me, Shiko Kaitani, thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful day up ahead. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
The biggest reggae and rhythm show ever on Kenyan television.
You have a ganja man and you wanna forget.